Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Esther sat behind the Suya stand by the corner of Oral Street, legs crossed at the ankle, smoke curling from her lips like secrets she no longer bothered hiding. The air in Ajagunal was thick with heat and heavy horns, with danfos screaming down pothole-filled roads and traders yelling prices like they were chanting battle cries. But Esther? She heard none of it. Her world was quieter now, the kind of quiet that only comes after heartbreak teaches you to stop expecting anything better. The cigarette in her hand wasn't about rebellion, it was survival. A poor man's therapy. She didn't start smoking to be cool or edgy. Life had simply pressed her neck to the floor so many times, she started needing something, anything, to fill the gaps where love used to live. The first puff had been a mistake. The second a relief. By the third, it was the only thing that made her feel like she was still in her body. Esther was just 22, but her eyes looked older. Tired, like they'd seen too much and unlearned too little. Her skin still held its beauty, but her spirit wore bruises invisible to everyone except those who knew how to look past the surface. In this part of Lagos, you either hardened up or drowned in your own softness. And Esther? She had drowned. Drowned so deeply that now she floated in the kind of numbness that scared even her. Every day she sat at that same corner, smoked her silence, and watched the world move without her. Her past never truly stayed behind her. It always walked half a step behind, breathing on her neck, waiting to be noticed. Jaden was the first boy who ever made her feel like she was more than the noise in her father's mouth or the absence in her mother's eyes. He came into her life wearing kindness like a well-ironed shirt, folding it neatly with every lie he told. She met him at a rooftop party in Suralere. He smelled of expensive cologne and empty promises. He laughed like someone who hadn't tasted pain. Esther should have known better, but whoever listens to their instincts when their heart is desperate to be held? At first, he was everything. Thoughtful, funny, always texting good morning and calling her queen. She didn't know it was all part of the grooming, making her feel chosen, so he could later make her feel disposable. The control came slowly, like a leaking tap. First, it was the jokes about her friends. Then the guilt trips when she didn't pick his calls immediately. Then the silence that felt like punishment. The day he called her worthless was the day she realized she had given him the tools he now used to bury her self-esteem. But even then she stayed. Not because she liked the pain, but because she had convinced herself that being unloved was better than being alone. It wasn't until he slapped her phone out of her hand during an argument and told her she had nothing without him that something inside her snapped. Like a mirror breaking. That night, barefoot and shaking, she walked out and never turned back. At least not then. Ajagunal didn't change just because Esther's heart did. The streets still hummed with suffering dressed as survival. People still hustled with their chins up and mouths full of complaints. Esther returned to her father's compound in a quiet daze. The same room that used to house her childhood dreams now echoed with unfamiliar silence. Her father barely looked up from his stool when she came in, just grunted and returned to his ogogoro. In that room, with cracked cement floors and a ceiling that creaked during rainfall, she sat on the edge of the bed and cried until her chest felt hollow. That was when she picked up smoking. Not for show. For silence. The smoke filled the room the way love never had. Every stick of cigarette was a way to slow down time, to push away the creeping thoughts that whispered Jaden's words back into her ears like echoes she didn't invite. Nobody in the compound asked questions. Lagos people mind their business too well. Occasionally, Mama Ifioma from next door would offer her food. Sometimes a stranger would tell her, "You fine why you day smoke like this?" And she would just smile and nod. Because what do you say when the wound is inside and language has no words for that kind of pain? What do you say when your voice is the only thing that ever told the truth and nobody listened? Healing didn't come riding on a horse or wrapped in inspirational quotes. It came in small things. Waking up without tears. Taking a shower. Looking in the mirror without hearing his voice in her head. It came slowly, unevenly, like Lagos traffic on a rainy day, frustrating and full of stops. Some days were better than others. Some days she would laugh with the kids in the compound. Other days she would stare at the wall for hours, replaying every mistake like a broken record. But deep down, she wanted to feel again, to believe again, and the city, for all its chaos, gave her moments. The sunset by the third mainland bridge. The smell of puff puff in the morning. The small child who ran up to her one day and said, "Auntie, you look like Beyoncé." Esther smiled for the first time in weeks that day. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, something is all you need to begin again. She didn't know it yet, but life was about to throw her a second lifeline. Not through love. Not through romance. But through a stranger with kind eyes and a fierce heart. A woman who would one day become her compass when she could no longer find her way. But for now, Esther sat on that bench outside Samson's suya, watching smoke rise like memories, and wondering if she was ever truly free, or just pretending to be. The rain had just finished falling when Esther first saw her. That kind of late evening Lagos rain that drenched the earth and left behind the smell of wet sand, diesel fumes, and unanswered prayers. Esther was standing under the rusted zinc overhang of the local bookshop, waiting for the downpour to end, so she could cross over to the roadside vendor selling yam porridge. She hadn't planned to go into the shop, but the woman behind her bumped into her with enough force to push the door open. And just like that, she found herself inside, surrounded by old paperbacks, dust, and a silence that wrapped around her like a warm scarf. The air smelled of forgotten dreams, of books that had seen better decades. There were 3 other people inside. One of them was a slim, brown-skinned girl with knotless braids tied up like a crown, sitting on a low stool with a book in her lap and her eyes on the world outside. She didn't look up immediately. She just turned a page, sipped from her bottle of La Casera, and said, "You're letting the water in." Something about the way she said it made Esther hesitate. There was no harshness in her voice, only truth, like someone who had long ago learned how to speak without breaking people. Esther mumbled an apology and stepped aside. She hadn't intended to speak further, but her eyes wandered over the girl's book, and she heard herself say, "I've read that before." A lie, but not a cruel one. The girl looked up for the first time, smiled like someone who hadn't forgotten how to mean it, and said, "Then let's talk about it." They ended up sitting on the shop floor for almost an hour. Esther didn't remember the book's title, and the girl, Naya, as she later introduced herself, didn't seem to care. Their conversation drifted easily, like the kind of talk that lives in silence until it finds the right listener. It started with books, moved to music, then dreams, and somehow, without planning it, Esther began talking about her life. Not everything. Just enough. A little about her mum leaving. A whisper about someone who wasn't kind. Naya listened without flinching, without offering advice she hadn't been asked for. She didn't ask intrusive questions, or wear the expression of someone trying to fix a broken thing. She just listened, fully, openly, like someone witnessing, not judging. Esther found herself laughing, real laughter that caught her by surprise. It had been months since a sound like that came out of her. And when it did, it felt strange, like tasting sugar after living on salt. The shop owner eventually tapped the metal shelf and said it was closing time. They both stood up at once. Esther dusted her jeans. Naya took down a small notebook from the counter, scribbled something in it, tore out the page, and handed it over. "That's my number," she said. "You don't have to use it. But if you ever want to be somewhere quiet again, you'll probably find me here." She waved, turned, and walked off into the night like she had done this before, like she had appeared and disappeared in other people's stories. Esther stood there holding the piece of paper like it weighed something more than digits. It felt like something rare, a small door opening where only walls used to be. Days passed before she called. Not because she didn't want to, but because her trust had been used like cheap plastic, bent, burned, and thrown out too many times. But the thought of that shop kept tugging at her, like a string tied to something soft inside her chest. One afternoon, after another long conversation with her father that ended with him blaming her mother again, Esther picked up her phone and called Naya. She answered on the first ring, said Esther, like she'd been expecting her, and that's how it began. They started meeting once a week, always at the shop or under the shade of the big almond tree by the church. With time it became twice a week, then more. Naya didn't pry into her wounds. Instead, she shared her own gently. Her mother died during childbirth. Her father remarried a woman who treated her like an accident. She had grown up angry, then tired, then strong. Her strength wasn't loud. It came in the form of questions that made Esther think, in words that didn't carry judgment, and in the way she noticed things, like how Esther's hands trembled slightly when she laughed, or how her voice got softer when she mentioned Jaden. She asked if Esther still saw him. Esther lied and said no. Naya didn't push. She just nodded and changed the subject. But that lie sat between them, quiet and waiting. Still, in all of this, something inside Esther began to soften. The smokes became fewer. The silences became less heavy. And laughter returned. Not every day, but enough to remind her that she was still alive. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when Naya showed up at Esther's compound unannounced. She was holding 2 bags of boli and a smile that carried sunlight. "I was nearby. Thought you might be hungry," she said, already stepping over the threshold. Esther hadn't cleaned the room in days. Ash from her last cigarette still sat in the corner, untouched. Clothes lay like lazy memories across the mattress. But Naya didn't flinch. She placed the food down, kicked off her slippers, and asked if there was water. That afternoon, they ate in silence, heads bent, hands sticky with palm oil. And something about the simplicity of it all made Esther want to cry. Not from sadness. From something she couldn't name. From being seen, maybe. From being accepted without condition. When Naya left that evening, she hugged Esther tightly. "You deserve softness," she whispered. The words didn't feel like advice. They felt like a mirror being held up. That night, Esther smoked the last stick in her pack. She didn't buy more the next day. Not because she promised herself anything, but because, for once, she didn't feel like hiding. And in that small change, something in her began to believe that healing wasn't some grand epiphany. Sometimes, it was just boli on the floor with someone who saw you and stayed anyway. It was a Saturday morning like any other, with the sun spilling lazily across the dusty balconies of Ajagunal, and the sound of a far-off gospel radio battling with the screeching laughter of children playing football in the alley. Esther was walking through the open market near Boundary, buying fruits she knew she wouldn't eat, just to feel busy. The air smelled of overripe tomatoes, sweat, and frying akra. She kept her face down, earphones in, not playing anything, just an excuse to avoid small talk. That was when she heard the voice. Smooth, low, and too familiar. "Esther?" She froze before she looked, and when she did, her stomach sank like a ship full of memories. There he was, Jaden, standing by a pepper cellar like he belonged in that moment. He looked different, not entirely, but just enough to confuse her. Fresh haircut, clean t-shirt, no loud yueldi. He smiled like they were old classmates, like there was no history soaked in heartbreak between them. "Wow, you still find past everybody here," he said, eyes scanning her face like he had a right to. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. He laughed, rubbed the back of his neck. "Relax. I just wanted to say hi. I'm not the same guy, I swear." His tone wasn't mocking. It was careful, practiced. He reached for a sachet of water from a nearby boy and tossed the seller 100 naira without blinking. She had no words. Just questions that made her chest itch. Why now? Why here? Why did her legs still feel weak when he spoke? She nodded once, managed a dry smile, and walked away. But her footsteps weren't steady. Something had cracked open, and she hated how easy it was to remember, how he used to make her feel like she was the center of the sky. The days that followed were heavy with silence, but not the peaceful kind Naya brought. This was a silence that throbbed in her bones and made every second feel too loud. She didn't tell Naya immediately. What would she say? That she saw the man who once broke her spirit, and her first instinct wasn't anger, but longing? That there was still a small, stupid part of her that missed the version of him that never really existed? She hated herself for it. She hated how, in the darkness of her room that night, she replayed the brief conversation over and over again, wondering if his smile had been real. She hadn't spoken to Jaden in almost a year. He had disappeared after she left, blocked her on everything, and that was that. Now here he was again, planted back into her world like a weed growing through concrete. And it didn't stop there. A few days later, she got a message. A number she didn't save, but she recognized the rhythm of his words. "I hope I didn't upset you the other day. Just wanted to talk. That's all." She stared at the message for hours, not knowing what to feel. Was it stupid to reply? Was it dangerous to pretend she could handle a conversation? She typed and erased her reply 7 times before finally settling on, "It's fine. Just surprised me." The moment she hit send, something shifted. It wasn't regret. Not yet. Just the familiar pull of something old and unfinished. The kind of thing you know is bad for you, but you still reach for, because your hands don't know how to stay empty. And when his reply came, "Would love to grab coffee if you're open to it," she didn't say no. She didn't say yes either. She left him on read. But her silence wasn't a rejection. It was a hesitation soaked in temptation. She began to drift, not visibly but underneath, like a boat whose anchor had loosened without anyone noticing. Her messages to Naya became shorter. Her laughter felt forced, like a performance she hadn't rehearsed well. She skipped their usual Tuesday meeting at the bookshop and blamed it on headaches. Naya didn't push, but her silence carried a weight of its own. And Esther felt it. She felt it in the way Naya stopped asking follow-up questions, in the way her eyes lingered a little longer during conversations. Esther wanted to come clean, but she couldn't find the right words, because she didn't know what she was doing. She told herself she was only curious. Just talking. Nothing serious. But she knew better. Jaden was like a scent you could never fully wash out of your clothes. He messaged her more often now, soft, calculated check-ins, laced with nostalgia. He told her he missed the sound of her voice, how nobody ever understood his silences like she did. It was always vague, but it reached the exact places where her wounds hadn't closed. When he finally called one night, and she picked up, her voice cracked on the second word. He told her he wasn't dating anyone, that he still thought about her on quiet nights, that he wasn't perfect, but he had changed. And maybe he believed that. Maybe he hadn't hit anyone since her. Maybe therapy had taught him to smile better. But what he didn't say was louder than what he did. And Esther, caught between memory and caution, chose not to hang up. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not because of anything he said, but because deep down she had always known she would answer. When she finally told Naya about it, it was on a humid afternoon while they sat near the gutter behind the bookshop, eating roasted groundnuts and watching the sky threaten rain. She said it like a confession, voice low, almost embarrassed. I saw him again. Jaden. We talked. The silence that followed felt like thunder waiting for permission. Naya didn't react with shock. She just chewed slowly, then wiped her hand on a napkin. And how did that go? She asked, but not like someone seeking gossip. More like someone weighing a wound in her palm. Esther shrugged. I don't know. He's different. Naya didn't flinch. Different how? Calmer, Esther replied. He says he's been going for therapy. Naya nodded once. And do you believe him? That question stung. Not because Esther didn't have an answer, but because she did. And she didn't like it. She looked away, said nothing. Naya stood slowly. Esther, people can change. But pain also learns how to wear perfume. Esther laughed, bitter and soft. I knew you'd say something like that. Not because I want to be right, Naya said, her voice kind but firm, but because I've seen too many women mistake silence for peace. She left not long after. No hugs this time. No yokes. And Esther sat there long after she was gone, listening to the city swallow her own thoughts. Something had shifted. A crack had formed in a wall she thought was solid, and she didn't know whether to patch it up or walk straight through it. The first time Esther met up with Jaden again, it wasn't planned. At least, that was what she told herself. She was passing through Suralere on her way to visit her aunt when he texted. I'm around Shitta. Just finished from the gym. You. Her fingers hovered over the screen longer than they should have. She told herself she didn't owe anyone an explanation. Not even Naya, who hadn't called since their last conversation ended in unfinished words and quiet exits. Esther replied with a simple, same area. Heading to Bode Thomas. And just like that, Jaden offered to wait. When she saw him standing beside a roadside fruit seller, dressed in black joggers and a hoodie slung around his neck, she felt something twist inside her. Not love. Not even desire. It was familiarity. The kind that wraps itself around your senses and convinces you that danger looks a lot like home. He didn't touch her. Not at first. They just walked. Talked. Laughed about how the traffic never got better, how the Okadas were now banned on some routes. He mentioned how much he'd grown, how books and therapy had opened his eyes. Esther listened, nodding, pretending the parts of her that remembered how his anger felt against her skin had gone silent. But they hadn't. They were just waiting their turn. Before they parted, he asked to see her again. She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew that once you step into familiar fire, the burn is never a surprise. In the days that followed, Esther found herself adjusting pieces of her life quietly, like she was folding clothes no one told her to touch. She didn't tell Naya anything. Their friendship had become thin, like cloth stretched too far, losing color and strength with each silent day. Naya still sent her the occasional message, links to music, a photo of the sky, a simple "How are you?" But Esther responded with delay, with caution, as if every word she typed was an apology she wasn't ready to say out loud. She spent more time with Jaden now, and he seemed softer. No raised voices. No wings. He spoke like a man who had learned how to hold back the parts of himself that once tore everything apart. He brought food when she didn't ask. He complimented her without expectation. He listened, or at least pretended to. Esther started to feel herself falling, not fast, not foolishly, but falling all the same. And the worst part was knowing she couldn't talk to anyone about it. Her other friends had long scattered across the city, too busy chasing survival to play therapist. And Naya? She'd already said what she needed to say. Esther wasn't ready to hear it again. She began smoking more often, but only in secret now, behind closed windows, as if her guilt had become a mirror she couldn't face. In the blur of it all, she convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, people really did change. That Jaden had finally learned how to love without hurting. That she could go back without losing herself. The shift happened slowly, like sunset sliding into night. Jaden stopped texting as quickly as before. He'd say he was tired or distracted. Sometimes, he canceled their plans last minute, claiming work emergencies. But Esther recognized the patterns, not because he repeated the same words, but because her body remembered the rhythm of being ignored. He no longer asked about her days. When she spoke about her writing or the book she was trying to finish, he nodded without hearing. She noticed how he still interrupted, still made her feel small in subtle ways. One evening, when she corrected him about something he misunderstood, he laughed too sharply and said, "This your new confidence, Naya must have taught you that." The way he said Naya's name was filled with spite dressed as sarcasm. Esther froze. She hadn't mentioned Naya in weeks. He had brought her up without prompt. And in that moment it dawned on her, he hadn't changed. He had only adapted. Learned new tricks. New tones. His sharpness was still there, but it wore cologne and came wrapped in polite sentences. That night, Esther lay awake long after Jaden left. Her room felt smaller, the air heavier. The ashtray by her window was full again. She stared at it, feeling a grief she couldn't name. Not for him. Not even for herself. But for the version of her who had believed, against all odds, that broken things could become beautiful just by being held long enough. When Naya finally reached out with a voice note instead of a message, Esther didn't play it immediately. She sat with her phone in hand, staring at the waveform like it carried judgment. She thought of deleting it, thought of pretending it never arrived. But something in her, something tired of pretending, hit play. Naya's voice was calm. No accusations. No bitterness. Just softness wrapped in steel. "I'm not angry, Esther," she said. "I'm just hurt. And scared for you. I know you think this is your story to finish your way. And maybe it is. But I've seen this story before. It doesn't end the way you think. I just hope when you look back, you remember that someone tried to remind you of your worth." Esther played it twice. Then 3 times. Her throat tightened with each replay. She didn't know what she was doing anymore. She was back in the orbit of a man who made her shrink. And in the process, she had pushed away the only person who ever helped her grow. She hadn't seen Naya in weeks. Hadn't returned her last message. But now, sitting in that same room with the fan rotating lazily overhead and the traffic howling in the distance, she felt the full weight of her choices. The silence around her wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the kind that comes right before something breaks. And this time, it wouldn't be her heart. It would be her last chance to save herself. Esther started waking up with a weight in her chest, the kind that made it hard to draw in a full breath even when the air was still. It was different now. Not the usual heaviness of sadness, but something else, a quiet dread. Jaden had stopped pretending. Not entirely. He still smiled in public, still said babe in front of others, still took her hand when crossing busy streets. But the mask was thinning, like paint peeling off a wall that had seen too many rains. He became colder in his tone, more dismissive in the way he responded to her. If she spoke too long about anything that didn't involve him, he would zone out, scroll through his phone, or throw in careless sarcasm that left invisible bruises. One night, after she'd spent hours cooking jollof and grilled chicken the way he liked, he walked in, looked at the plate, and said, "This rice is too dry," then left it untouched. He didn't even notice her silence. Or maybe he did, and just didn't care. The worst part wasn't the way he acted. It was how familiar it all felt. Like slipping into an old coat that never quite fit right. She found herself apologizing for things that didn't need apologies, tiptoeing around him like walking on cracked glass. One evening, while sweeping, her phone buzzed. It was Naya's name again. This time, just a single full stop. Esther stared at it for a long time. A message that didn't ask anything, didn't say anything, but carried the weight of everything that was left unsaid. She wanted to reply. She wanted to explain. To say that she missed her. That she was sorry. That she was stuck in something she didn't know how to walk away from without breaking herself again. But words felt weak now. She remembered when she used to feel strong around Naya, like she was seen, heard, held up. But Jaden had a way of making strength feel like stubbornness and silence feel like peace. Every time she tried to stand her ground, he twisted her words, made her question her own memory. "That's not what I said," he'd say. "You're too sensitive," or "Why do you always take things the wrong way?" And the more it happened, the more she started wondering if maybe she was the problem after all. It was gaslighting, but she didn't know the term back then. She just thought maybe love meant adjusting, shrinking, rethinking, until your voice could fit in someone else's version of who you should be. One evening, he raised his voice during a disagreement about a missed call. Not shouting, just enough to startle her, just enough to bring back the trembling. She didn't cry. She just sat down slowly, the room spinning slightly. He apologized the next morning, brought her small chops, and told her he'd just had a bad day. She nodded and said, "It's okay." But it wasn't. Nothing was. She knew it, and the mirror knew it too. The one above her dresser, the one that showed her reflection getting smaller, dimmer, quieter with every passing week. A week after the raised voice incident, something inside her snapped, not loud, but sure. She was walking back from the market, plastic bags cutting into her palms, when she saw a couple arguing near the entrance of her compound. The woman was crying. The man was cursing. It was all too familiar. Esther slowed her steps and just watched them. The woman was defending herself, explaining things she had no business explaining, saying sorry with the urgency of someone trying to keep a broken door from falling off its hinges. It was like watching a version of herself from the outside, and it broke her. That night, she didn't cook. She didn't text Jaden. She sat in her room, turned off the lights, and wrote a letter on the back of an old exercise book. She didn't write to him. She wrote to herself. A version of herself that once believed pain was a requirement for love. She poured it all out, the fear, the confusion, the lies she told herself just to make it through the day. And when she finished, she folded it and slipped it under her pillow. The letter didn't fix anything, but it was the first thing she had done in a long time that was completely for her. She cried afterward, but the tears were quiet, not like the ones before, not helpless. They felt like rain after harmattan, washing something stale out of the air. The next morning, Esther stood in front of her wardrobe and packed a small bag. Not because Jaden had hit her. He hadn't. Not because he screamed. He didn't. But because her spirit was bleeding and she couldn't keep pretending it wasn't. She didn't tell him she was leaving. She just left. Quietly. A bolt ride to her aunt's house in Akoka. No goodbye. No long explanation. Just space. She stayed with her aunt for a few days, breathing differently. The first 2 nights were rough. Her body still expected his calls. Her ears still listened for his footsteps. But the silence there was gentler. It wasn't peace yet, but it wasn't fear either. It was enough. On the 3rd day, she sat on the balcony with a glass of water and texted Naya. Nothing long. Just 3 words. "I left him." She didn't expect a reply. But it came. Almost immediately. "Where are you?" That was all. Esther smiled faintly, and for the first time in weeks, the smile didn't feel like it had to ask for permission to exist. There was still so much to fix. So much inside her that felt bent and bruised. But for now, she had made one decision for herself. One small, powerful, terrifying choice. She didn't know what came next. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the not knowing was a kind of freedom, too. Esther sat by the open window of her aunt's room, watching the wind tease the curtains like it had a secret to share. The compound below buzzed with the usual noise. Children dragging old tires in endless circles. Women exchanging gossip loud enough to cross balconies. The smell of fried onions floating in from someone's kitchen. But inside her, there was a stillness. Not the uncomfortable kind that she had grown used to, but the type that allowed her thoughts to land without running from them. She hadn't seen Jaden since she walked out, and he hadn't come looking either. No missed calls. No texts. Nothing. At first, the silence made her stomach knot, like she was bracing for a storm that never arrived. But each day that passed without him trying to manipulate his way back and felt like peeling off a layer of guilt that didn't belong to her. Her aunt gave her space without question, just offering food and the occasional soft smile that didn't need words. She would sit beside her some nights, both of them sipping Lipton tea with too much milk, letting the fan hum above their heads like a lullaby. One evening, her aunt said quietly, "You're strong, you know. Stronger than your mother ever managed to be." Esther didn't reply. She didn't know how to feel about that kind of strength, the kind that came from surviving what should have never happened in the first place. But it sat with her long after the tea was finished and the lights went out. She saw Naya again after 9 weeks. It happened without warning, without ceremony. Esther had returned to the bookshop on a quiet Wednesday, not expecting to see anyone she knew. She only wanted the silence. The comfort of that space, the dusty shelves, the smell of old paper and varnished wood. It had always been Naya's favorite place, but she hadn't texted to ask if she'd be there. She didn't want to assume. She was flipping through a novel she'd never heard of when she heard the familiar footsteps. Slow, balanced, soft. And there she was, standing at the end of the aisle, wearing the same faded denim jacket, with her braids now longer, the color closer to copper. Their eyes met, and for a few seconds the world slowed. Neither of them moved. Neither of them smiled. Just silence. Until Naya spoke, voice calm even. "You look tired." Esther laughed, not out of amusement, but relief. A real laugh. Like air after being held underwater. "I feel it," she replied, closing the book and placing it back on the shelf. Naya nodded, then walked closer, took a seat on the bench by the window. Esther joined her, no words needed. They sat like that for nearly an hour, just breathing in the same space again. When the owner finally dimmed the lights and began locking up, Naya turned to her and said, "Healing isn't always graceful. Sometimes it's just choosing not to go back, even when everything inside you wants to." Esther nodded slowly. "I almost did," she admitted. Naya reached out, gently squeezed her hand. "But you didn't." Later that night, they found themselves walking down the street, neither of them in a rush to get home. The roads were quieter than usual, the night sky wide and unapologetically dark. Streetlights flickered. Power was out again, and people were already lighting candles behind cracked windows. They passed a vendor selling roasted corn, and Naya bought 2 without asking. They sat on a low wall beside a locked kiosk, eating slowly, kernels crackling between their teeth. For a while they didn't talk. Esther watched a moth circle the dim glow of the only working streetlight, and thought about how many times she had chased things that only hurt her in return. "I don't think I know who I am without pain," she said quietly. Naya looked over, chewing thoughtfully, then said, "You're not meant to be anyone because of pain. You're meant to be someone after it." The words didn't land like advice. They landed like truth. Not a loud one, not a sermon, just something Esther knew she needed to hear, something she could carry with her. They finished eating and stood up to leave. Before they parted ways, Naya said, "I missed you. Not just the version of you that laughs, but the one that doubts, the one that breaks, the one that still chooses to get up." Esther didn't know how to reply, so she did something better. She hugged her, and this time, she held on long enough to feel something shift inside her, like an old door creaking open for the first time in years. In the weeks that followed, Esther didn't pretend to be whole. She didn't rush to post quotes about healing or tweet vague messages about growth. She simply lived. Woke up, brushed her teeth, took morning walks around the estate. She started journaling again, not because someone told her it was healthy, but because writing felt like remembering how to breathe without shaking. She got a job at a small cafe near Yaba Tech, nothing fancy, just part-time work clearing tables, taking orders. But it gave her rhythm. It gave her purpose. Sometimes Jaden crossed her mind, usually in fragments, a word he used to say, a song he played too often. But those memories no longer pulled her under. They floated, then passed. One afternoon, she found herself standing on a footbridge, looking down at the traffic on Icorda Road, and it hit her how long it had been since she felt afraid. Not numb, not cautious, just calm. She wasn't healed. Not completely. But she was no longer breaking. And for her, that was more than enough. When she got home that day, there was a text from Naya waiting. "Reading anything interesting?" Esther smiled, took a photo of the book beside her pillow, and sent it back. Her reply was simple but honest, still figuring out the ending. It was the truth. But for the first time, it didn't scare her to admit it. Sometimes, the hardest person to walk away from is the one you thought would save you. But healing begins the moment you choose peace over pain, even if it means standing alone for a while. Don't let guilt tie you to places where your joy keeps shrinking. You deserve a kind of love that doesn't ask you to suffer first. Choose you, even if it shakes everything around you. Real strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's just choosing not to answer that message. May you never mistake brokenness for destiny. May your heart find the strength to walk away from anything that dims your light. May your soul remember how worthy it is of love that doesn't bruise, joy that doesn't come with conditions, and peace that stays without performance. May the silence around you become healing, not haunting. And when life tries to drag you back to what you've outgrown, may grace stand between you and the past. You will rise, you will breathe, and you will bloom in your time. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.